and welcome to the show. And we have Leo and that. Wally, could I pass over to you to kick off with Dr. Rita on some questions, please?
Sure. Rita, I'm Wally Jensen. I'm a retired U.S. Navy chaplain. I long ago was an acquaintance of Herm Kaiser. So I have fond memories of him, as does everyone who ever met him, I think, have fond memories of Herm Kaiser.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us this evening. We are a group of people who are interested in moral injury. We all have had prior military service or experience with the military. And I spent about 40 years after I came back from Vietnam trying to be able to talk to my wife about moral injury and what I experienced in Vietnam. And so I understand, and I have come to the conclusion that one of the things that we can do best for those who suffer moral injury, whether it comes from combat experience, EMTs, police officers, other first responders, etc., is to lend them our ears so they can gain their voice, because I believe that it's when you can talk about the experience that the shame loses its power over you. And so that's kind of what I'm doing. So I wonder if you would share with us how it is that you came to be interested and become an expert in moral injury.
The long story, I'm not going to tell the long story, but the beginning of my life story is that I grew up in the U.S. military. And I had a father who was a World War II combat veteran. He landed at Normandy and went all the way to Central Europe as an automatic rifleman. And then he came home kind of a wreck from that, and spent about a year recovering from some electroshock treatment he received at Walter Reed. And then he re-enlisted and was sent to Japan, where he met my mother. And so he became my stepfather. I was 2 at the time. And so I was raised in a family with a stepfather who was a military veteran and in the U.S. military. But when I was 16, he was sent to Vietnam as a medic, and he did 2 tours. And he came home so changed, I didn't want to be around him. And that was just sort of hanging there as part of my life, that I felt alienated and separated from my family when I went to college, because he came back just as I was leaving for college. And in a kind of oddly estranged way from him, I didn't want to go home and be around him. And that was just a part of my life story. And then I spent many years as a peace activist, probably influenced by some of what happened in my family. And in 2009, I began to work with a friend, Gabriella Latini, a colleague at the place I was working. And we felt like the peace movement wasn't having much impact on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, even though they were clearly not good. And we thought maybe a different strategy might be in order. And we saw a film called Soldiers of Conscience, which talked about the moral deliberations that people in the military at Fort Jackson in the U.S. Army were how they were thinking about orders to redeploy. And some of them tried to become conscientious objectors after one tour. Others reasoned through that they didn't want to abandon their unit because people depended on them, or there were other reasons they decided to redeploy. And we realized that the conversations that around the morality of the wars and why they should stop really didn't include the voices of military veterans. And so we decided to organize a Truth Commission on Conscience in War, which had a big hearing at Riverside Church. But in the process, we were given that essay in 2009 on moral injury by a team of VA clinicians, Veterans Affairs clinicians. And we realized, oh, this is what we are talking about. This moral injury piece is absolutely crucial to the conversations about war and the people we send to fight them, and that we need to ask people to take personal responsibility for our willingness to send people who come home with this. And so the commission, the Truth Commission itself, made a recommendation that there be public education about moral injury in veterans. And so I worked with a team to raise the funds to create a center at a seminary in Texas that would do that kind of public education. So that's how I got started in it. And I just kept reading and doing the work. And eventually this very large nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that had a lot of veteran services, got very interested in moral injury for their own clients and their own veterans. And so eventually I wound up moving over to work for Volunteers of America. That's the name of the nonprofit, in 2017. And we ran a 2-year, very successful pilot program that helped veterans in our own transitional housing programs and in our own care systems where they were being treated for substance misuse or homelessness or other things. And we ran 100 veterans through it in 2 years. It was peer facilitated by veterans we trained to facilitate the program, and we did it in small groups like military squads. And the data, we had a research team doing surveys and studying it, and it proved to be even more successful than I thought, that I actually hoped it would be. I just hoped they would get some kind of improvement from trauma exposure, from feeling terrible, from not sleeping, all the kinds of things that moral injury can do to you. I didn't expect 6 months later for them to continue to be improving. Like, instead of, like, I expected a big jump at the end of the program, and then 6 months later, as life hit, that there would be some decline. And I was just hoping nobody went back to baseline, and no one did go back to baseline. But and there was a drop in certain markers, but the 3 that kept going up, which was like completely unexpected, was that they continued to grow in self-worth and in optimism, and engagement with religion.
Yeah. And you mentioned there, Doctor, that you mentioned there about your childhood. Can you just click back a little bit? You flipped over a little bit. Could you go back to what your parents, you mentioned your father. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
He came home from Vietnam very cold and angry and controlling. Mm-hmm. And since I had gone off to college, I was feeling pretty independent. And I didn't want to go home the summer after my first year in college, but my mother asked me to come home. And so I did. And so my father and I fought the entire summer. It was just an awful struggle. So I chose not to live at home anymore. And then he died of a heart attack 8 years after he came home. And when he died, I was so avoiding him. I was in Switzerland for 2 years. I was living in Switzerland when he died. And so it was just an unresolved relationship. He died. And I remember these conflicting feelings of sorrow that he died, but also relief that he wasn't the last. My mother had cancer at the time, and we all expected my mother to die first. But she didn't. She hung on for quite a long time. And my brother is 12 years younger. I was very worried about him being around my father. And so I remember at my father's death feeling a little relieved that it was my mother that survived my father.
Yeah.
Right. That I didn't think my father was being a good parent. And so it was things like that that were just difficult. And I always felt bad, I think, or just not good. Like I hadn't done my family duty by abandoning my family the way I did. But I couldn't find any way to cope with my father's behavior.
A little bit of unnecessary guilt would have been, Doctor.
Perhaps this is a vague uneasiness that there must have been something I could have done. And he did get better. It wasn't that he stayed so cold and angry. He actually, about 3 years after he came home, attempted to apologize. He said, "I know I've been difficult to live with, and I'm sorry about that." And I remember thinking, too little, too late.
Mm. That's right. That's right.
So I just kind of went on with my life and haven't been until recently particularly close to my siblings. They both had job issues when I was living in my 40s in Minnesota, and so they came up, stayed with me till they got settled, and so they wound up staying in Minnesota for 20 years, while I left, went to Harvard, and did other things. But now I'm back in Minnesota, where I decided I would retire, and I'm living with my sister, and my brother's in a senior care center.
Oh, wow.
Even though he's 12 years younger than I am, his health is worse. Yeah.
You do amazing work. I've watched some of your videos. Can I just pass you over to Leo for a question there, please, Doctor?
Sure.
Hi, Rita.
Hi.
We've got, apart from Wally there, Marty and I have kind of come to moral injury relatively recent compared to you, let's say in the last 2 years. With my interaction I've had a few years ago at the U.S. Work College on Veterans, I first heard about moral injury from Wally. And to use an expression using the penny dropped. You kind of referred to it in your situation as well. You said, that's it.
That's it.
Okay, well, the penny dropped for me because both Marty and I have, both our fathers were in the same battle. They came home damaged. The battle in the Congo in 1961.
Right.
My dad was a commander, and Marty's father was an armored car commander. So we're coming from a certain point of view where we know a lot of people who are actually physically suffering moral injury. My dad didn't really suffer it except for the silence part. He buried everything, but he was a wonderful dad all his life, retired as a colonel, and I was in the army after him. But what we find, I'm sure you can relate to this, and I'd like you to tell me if we're on the right track. I mean, what we're finding in the veterans that I still know of this battle, there were 155 of them, there are 38 still alive. They're suffering, some of them are suffering very seriously through silence, heavy drinking. 2 of them ended up in mental homes. There were 5 suicides that we know of. Some of these men were only 15 and 16 years old, boys in the battle. They lied about their ages to get jobs. So that's where we're coming from. And we're trying to, as Wally very aptly puts it, we're trying to lend our ears so that to give them a voice. And I think we're reasonably successful at our level. Now, we're not at the same category of standard or level that you're at for years and years. But I think we're getting there because you're saying the things that we think. We're talking about self-worth, optimism used, family guilt, conflicting feelings, sorrow, relief. And then it's the transgenerational effect comes out from what you were saying as well. And that's exactly what we're finding. And tonight you've kind of dotted the I's and crossed the T's for us, I think. And I think Wally and Marty might agree with me at that. Based on what you were saying, I think we're on the right foot, what we're doing.
I think you are too. And it really was, it's in an odd way, the work on moral injury that closed the circle of my relationship to my father, because I have a cousin who's more like an aunt to me because she's a generation older than I am. And so she was very close to my father. They were cousins too. And so he actually talked to her about, her family helped him recover from his World War II experience, that he stayed with them rather than his NATO family. And so he was close to them. And so he actually told my cousin what had happened to him in Vietnam, which he would never talk to us about. And I found that out by accident when I went to visit her. And I was in 2011, after I'd started to work on a book on moral injury. And she said, well, what are you working on now? And I said, well, I'm working on this concept, moral injury. She said, what's that? I said, well, it's what happens to people who go to war and have to kill, or terrible things happen and they come back changed. And she looked at me and she said, well, I think that's what your daddy had. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, in Vietnam, they killed that spy or that girl he was working with. And when she said that, I knew exactly who she was talking about. He had told we did those tapes, you mail tapes back and forth, and he would mail tapes from Vietnam, and he would tell me about this 16-year-old Vietnamese girl, my age, exactly my age, that was his translator. And this was a government pacification program where the medics would go into villages and treat people medically as a gesture of goodwill to win them over. And so he was working with this young woman, and he admired her greatly. He thought she was really courageous and a really good translator. And so I knew about her. I didn't know she died. She said, well, it wasn't good. He found her body, and she'd been raped and mutilated by the American troops. And I just thought, oh my God, the whole layers of things to be angry about, his own people. And when he came home, I remember this too. The first thing he wanted to do was leave the military. He'd been in for 28 years. He wouldn't stay for 30. My mom, you get more benefits, you stay for 30. My mom was angry that he wouldn't do it. And she kept saying, why don't you? He said, I don't want to stay in this military. It's not the military I signed up for. That's all he would say.
It's the same, Rita, we're talking about transgeneration, just because what you're talking about there, and thank you for being so honest, is the transgeneration runs in my family, but my mom always said that, I said, she loved my dad when she met him. She said, but they sent the wrong man home. That was her words. They sent the wrong man home, and he came back as a very, very violent man, which led my mom to try take our lives, attempted murder, suicide. But the luck of the Irish, she never succeeded. She finished her own life early in the end, but she did love him. But she said that he came back, and then they didn't come back with no help whatsoever laid out. I know things are better now, but when I think of all of us children, and all 6 of us survived, but it's not just the moral injury of the man or the woman or whatever, or the person that wore in place or in the ambulance. It's the family. Because as Wally told a story before about his wife, like, they know what's going on, they just don't know what to put a name on it. And it is moral injury. Right. Until I met Leo and Wally, I didn't understand, Doctor, what moral injury was. And it's given me great relief.
And I think one thing people misunderstand about it is it's not a mental health disorder. It is actually an appropriate moral response to horrifying things.
Yes.
And so and those feelings of horror, disgust, guilt, outrage, shame, there's a whole array of multiple feelings that come from that kind of moral violation of your sense of what's right, and that they're so painful that and if there's no way to deal with them, people just try to squash them. And if they do, they can become sort of cold and angry, or they can just be just flat, depressed, like unable to feel anything, or try to control everything because they don't want to feel those things. And so there are a lot of difficult behaviors that come from having moral injury, because your conscience is afflicting you in such a way, it's really hard for you to cope. And you're right, people will start drinking, they will overwork to exhaustion so they don't have to think about it, just drive themselves into the ground, or there are all kinds of addictive behaviors. It's not just drugs or alcohol, it can be sex, it can be gambling, there's other ways to distract yourself. And they'll socially isolate. It's like they don't want to be emotionally available to anybody because they would have to go to those places that are too vulnerable. And the last thing they will do is take their own life, die by suicide. I have a friend who was in the Army, in the Air Force as a Gray Beret. They're called Gray Berets, a special operations unit to do weather intelligence. And his whole unit came back alive. He was an officer in that unit, and they all came back alive. And then they've had a number of suicides. And there are, of course, more deaths by suicide in the American veteran population than there were casualties in the two wars recently. So it's a serious thing. It's not, that's the tricky thing is it isn't a disorder. And so when people, you say, well, they need mental health treatment. Well, they might have PTSD or something else, but the moral injury isn't fixable in the way that we think of as mental health treatment. Right? You can't make the event go away. You can't make the experience disappear. And so really what someone needs is to be believed, to have their feelings believed, so they can feel real and validated in what's happening to them. And it's really that point of empathy and believing them, that sense of yeah, it is really as bad as you feel it is. Just to admit that is the first step in their opening up, telling their story, and beginning to process. And if you and it's a difficult situation, because generally when we want to help people, we say, well, it'll be all right, or it really isn't that bad, or if you think about it differently, it might not look so bad. We try to comfort people that way. It's no help with moral injury. It's really as bad as they think it is.
I went to Vietnam as a 19-year-old kid. Had my 20th birthday in Vietnam, actually. And when I came back, I didn't have a way to talk about what I was feeling. And over the years, I really struggled with that. And I guess it was from 2010 until 2017, I worked as the canon for the Episcopal Bishop for the Armed Forces. And we were asking ourselves, Memorial Day was coming up, and we were asking ourselves, what can we do something special for veterans, and how would we reach out to them? I suggested that Rolling Thunder was coming into town, and I live in Alexandria, and Moral Injury Care, Rolling Thunder was coming into town. I suggested that we should do something along the lines of what was done in the fall for blessing of the pets to honor of St. Francis. So we should have a blessing of the bikes. And we reached out to several chapters of Rolling Thunder. We said, if you'll come to the National Cathedral, we will do a blessing of the bikes. And we had, I think, about 100, right around 100 bikes that came with riders. So we had 150 to 200 people that were there. And we did a little opening outside the west entrance to the cathedral. And then we went out amongst the riders, and I would speak to them, identify myself as a Vietnam veteran, ask them where they'd been, ask them a little bit about their experience. And one of the interesting things to me was, as we went around, I would say to them, two things are going to happen. One is I'm going to use a water, holy water, and I'm going to sprinkle profusely all over. So if you don't want your bikes to have water spots, this would be a good time to let me know that. And then I would pray with them and bless them and dedicate their bikes. And about the fourth set of bikes that I came across, I realized that there were tears coming down the eyes of the veterans and some of their significant others. And I began asking them about that. And the stories were similar to mine. And it was a really a moving period for myself. And the bishop was also a Vietnam veteran. He'd been in Vietnam about the same time that I was, actually. And so we started talking about this. And one of the things that we realized is that when I would speak to the veterans, we never set foot inside the building. It was all done out in the courtyard right in front of the west entrance. They would say things like, this is the first time I've been at church since I was. And we had veterans from Korea, we had veterans from Serbia, we had veterans from all kinds of conflicts. And their response was very similar. I haven't been in church since. And I got curious about that because it had been very difficult for me to come back to church. I grew up in a little church in North Dakota. And when I came back from Vietnam, there were about a little town of 1,500 people, rural community. There were about 8 of us who were in Vietnam roughly at the same time. I was the only one that was back at that time. A classmate of mine came back earlier than I did. He came home 2 weeks after I got to Vietnam. He was killed in a firefight shortly before I had a chance to get together with him. So I was the only veteran in church Vietnam veteran in church that Sunday morning, and I heard the most aggressive anti-war sermon that I had ever heard. And I was looking around and realized I was the only one that had been in Vietnam who was in church that morning. So you can imagine who I thought he was talking to. And I was so shamed by that experience that to this moment, 50 years later, I've not been inside that particular building.
Yeah.
And I've been ordained for 47 years. So it's not that I left the church, but that congregation really did a lot of injury to me. And I couldn't get words for it. I couldn't find a way to talk about it. And in discovering moral injury, and that was through reading Achilles in Vietnam, Jonathan Shea's book, I began to kind of follow that. And when people would ask me initially about Vietnam, I would make up things. I'd say, well, I was a typist. I sat at a desk and typed, or I spent a lot of time at the exchange, or silly stuff. I just couldn't talk about it, didn't want to talk about it. And that was the experience that I've found amongst veterans broadly. And now I'm seeing it amongst others, police officers. We've had 2 police officers on the podcast that we've spoken about. It's kind of similar. And the language that I had at the time is I lost my youth in Vietnam. Now I talk about moral injury because that's really what happened to me.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that we can't seem to find, I think here, at least in the US, we can't seem to find a way to speak about this theological issue. And I use that term theological intentionally because I think when we talk about religious issues, there are all kinds of barriers that immediately come up. I think Americans are as afraid of religion as they are of a lot of other things. And we can't face it. So the idea that we can find a language that allows people to talk about their experience and deal with it theologically is one of the things that I think our attempts as a Moral Injury International to talk about, to give people permission to talk about it theologically rather than to disguise it as Stoic philosophy or try to put it in some medical category. It cannot be diagnosed. There are no axes that you can fit people into, as the DSM, what is it, 5 or 6 now?
5, yeah.
We can't. It doesn't fit.
Yeah, it doesn't work, and there's no protocol for fixing it because it isn't fixable. That the protocols are meant to fix some disorder, and that biomedical model, it's number one, very individualistic, and it's a model of fixing things, and it doesn't work for moral injury. My sort of sense of what is most effective at helping people recover is a group process that is highly ritualized. Because the military knows you can change people if you highly ritualize something and make them repeat it in small groups with a lot of group pressure. So they can take somebody who's like 18, just a high school graduate, ordinary person, and push them through 9 to 12 weeks of everything being, even sleeping being ritualized. Everything has a structure, a very formal structure. And then they go through that, they come out the other end, they have been radically changed, and they didn't do it themselves. That was just kind of something that happened to them. They committed to it, but it was really a lot of change in a very short period of time. We have no process nearly as effective for helping people transition out. So it's like a friend of mine, who was Marine Corps Special Ops says, you can take an Abrams tank and put it on the street, paint it yellow and call it a school bus, but it's going to chew up asphalt and run over cars because that's what it's designed to do. It takes a lot more engineering than paint and a sticker. And what the military tries to do to get people out is paint them and put a sticker on them, and then they're out. And so we don't have a good process that deals with all those inner struggles and things. And I'm actually convinced, because our own program is pretty ritualized, that if you can get people in a small group to commit to a process, and they don't have to run the process, somebody else is running the process, and they just commit to being empathetic and going with it, that you can get them very far in not that many days. And they're always surprised at the end how changed they feel, and because they didn't do the work themselves.
Yeah.
It was a group process.
Yeah, so true.
And there's something magical about that.
The Native American peoples have a much better sense of that. Growing up in North Dakota, I know something about the Sioux Nation. I've learned from working with people in the Episcopal Diocese of the Navajo about the Southwestern tribes and their rituals and the warrior dances and so forth, that are liturgies. And we have access to that, but we don't avail ourselves of it, seems to me.
Yeah. And my friend Chris Webb, who's an anthropologist who was an Iraq War veteran in the Army, actually himself was under treatment at the VA for PTSD. He's a combat veteran. And he said, well, the PTSD treatment helped him manage symptoms, and he did improve on that score, but he still felt miserable. He just didn't feel right. And he heard about this program where the sweat lodge ceremony was being offered to non-Native American vets by the VA that had a Native practitioner of it, a Sioux practitioner of it, who was willing to allow non-Native vets in there. And so he went through this whole sweat lodge ceremonial process. It was very intense and rigorous. And that's what really helped him. And he said that the leader, the person who led it, said to them, we're going to have to help you learn to stop needing to fight people. Yeah,
and that's what it boils down to. Leo, can I bring you in there with Dr. Rita, please? We've been leaving you sitting there.
Sorry. Yeah.
No. Rita, everything you've been saying is very uplifting for me, to the extent that I think that it's kind of proven to us that we're on the right track in what we're trying to do. You're saying the same words we're now saying. We've come to it a lot later than you, other than Wally, of course. But like in recent years, I've been involved in Sarajevo, Kosovo, West Bank, Ramallah. I've seen now moral injury. People I worked with suffering from moral injury. I didn't recognize it 4 or 5 years ago when I was there. But you said a couple of things that resonate very much with me. You talk about people came back, they weren't validated. They got no validation that what they did was okay. We're finding exactly the same with the Irish Army. Now, we've already been talking military here, basically, but as Wally said at the very beginning, it's also in first responders and police forces. I know it's in the paramedics. I know it's in the hospitals. I know it's in the corporate sector. I know it's in universities even, and the key thing among all of this, I think, or the common factor among all of it, is betrayal. They feel betrayed by higher authority who won't listen to them when they've got a problem. And, so you're nodding, which means it's good for me that you're nodding, which means I'm saying the right things. And then just to finish, what we've discovered is that the more that we understand about moral injury, and I've seen this in people I talk to, children of the veterans of with my dad and so on, they're beginning to understand, now I know why my father never gave me a hug. Now I know why my father was going down to the garden shed, sitting for hours smoking on his own. Now I know why he was drinking too much. And because they've come to this understanding, some of them have said, I forgive my dad now. I forgive. And they have got closure. So their moral injury can be helped if a better understanding. So really, they're the points I'd like to make. Thanks,
Yeah,
Rita.
no, I agree. Learning about what happened to my father in Vietnam helped me forgive him too. I mean, I can't even imagine what he went through.
Yeah.
I just, you know, it was awful. It was just awful. And I think the betrayal piece is especially powerful in relation to systems. Because we're also seeing, in the US, we have a terrible healthcare system. And so there's a new book out called If I Betray These Words, about doctors who feel like they've betrayed the words they promised their patient, to give the best care possible to their patients, and the managed care system will not let them, and how deeply they feel like they've betrayed the words that, and they're betrayed by the system, which also involves them having to betray their own words. So it's a sort of cascade of different forms of betrayal. And the anthropologist friend I mentioned who went through the sweat lodge process said that one of his experiences in Iraq was that they had captured all these different people who were prisoners, and they were trying to figure out what to do with them. And he was guarding a man who was terrified. He was just shaking. He was terrified. And he said he was just a farmer, and he believed him. He was just terrified, and he didn't think he was any kind of terrorist, and that he was just a guy who was in the wrong place and got caught. And he was ordered to put him on a truck to be sent somewhere. And he knew if he put him on the truck, he'd probably never come back and probably wound up tortured or dead. And he said, and he was ordered to put him on the truck, and he felt like the guy had done nothing wrong, and he was sentencing him to death by putting him on the truck. And he said, and I put him on the truck.
Wow.
And so he betrayed his own his own intuition, but he was ordered to do it, so it was a betrayal by the authorities, who didn't even ask him, and there are whole layers of it, which he had to come back and process.
And I think Leo brings that in quite a bit, Doctor, is on betrayal. We talk about it a lot in a smaller scale, but just going back to Leo's dad commanded it, and my dad served in it. Lots of others, only 165 men. That sounds small, but they came back with 10% of them, roughly, or let's go 8%, once we can prove, took their own lives.
Yeah.
And what hasn't been the statistics that hasn't been done that I've been working on is that a lot of the women and children of those generations, and there was up to Leo and myself, the Nakashis, is probably 10,000 Jarrell babies, as they call, from bringing the Jarrell men back home. So you calculate that, you look at that, and you're thinking, wow. And that's just out of one little platoon. And more to the point was where Leo says they were let down. If they'd have been recognized, maybe they would have had a better life. Maybe, things would have been different.
I think that's a difficult one, because if you yourself do something you feel was really wrong, like my friend putting that man on the truck, it doesn't help when somebody says you did the right thing. So I think trying to prescribe what you want to offer to people you think might have moral injury can backfire, because they may, it's the way now, because of Vietnam and how badly the US treated the veterans who came home from Vietnam, called them baby killers and awful things. There's been this reverse sort of virtue signaling, like we don't want to do that to these veterans, and so people just automatically will say to a veteran, thank you for your service. And most of them deeply resent it or don't like it. Because it's basically not about them as persons. It's just these people are just trying to be nice and say that they're good people, so they're going to thank you. And for many of them, being thanked for killing people doesn't feel good.
On one
Wally
of our
has said that.
previous podcasts, Wally actually said that same thing. Wally mentioned that on a podcast. Wally, can you just give us a quick bit on that, please, for Rita?
Yeah, well, I think that thank you for your service has become sort of a Deming platitude, and it is virtue signaling. And when people say thank you for your service to me, I try to be polite and accept it as a well-intentioned offering, but it really irritates me. And I think to myself, you have no idea what you asked me to do on your behalf.
Right.
And so for a number of years, my wife Rita, who's been just a wonderful companion and friend and someone that I trust deeply, she works out at Mount Vernon, and they do twice a day tours, laying of the wreath at the tomb of General Washington. And she will oftentimes ask if there's a veteran in the group, and if there is, the veteran, she'll ask them to come up and do the reading and lay the wreath. And she was saying, thank you for your service. And I said, don't do that. And she said, well, what am I supposed to say? And I said, welcome home would be a good thing. And she said, well, I can't do that. And I said, well, you didn't ask me what you could do. You asked me what I think you should do, and try it. And it was a while. And she came home one day and she said, well, I did what you said I should do. I said, welcome home. And I said, what happened? Well, there were two different veterans that she had spoken to. One started to cry and asked if he could give her a hug. The other one said, well, I've been home a long time. It's a little bit late, but I'll take it for what the offer is. And so that now is her standard. Welcome home.
Yeah. And I think mostly if I run across a veteran, instead of saying something that's formulaic, I'll just say, where did you serve? How, what was your MOS? Or I'll start a conversation like that. And if you just throw in a term like MOS, that makes you an insider. That's like, okay, yes. Well, right, you're not just totally ignorant and you're going to thank me. You're somebody I might be able to talk to. And so often I get the most interesting conversations with veterans, and it doesn't ever turn into a need to say something formulaic. And a couple of times I've talked to a veteran and I could tell they were really proud of what they'd done. And then I'll say, well, I'm really glad. Thanks for your service. And they seem grateful for that. But I don't offer that very often. And I only offer it when I think it might be appreciated as a genuine thing, that I actually feel that way about them. Right. So, and so that I think, but that actually takes time to be attentive and treat the person as a person rather than as a symbol for something, or as a role, just a role. Yeah.
Oftentimes, in my experience, people have identified me as a veteran, and the conversations get bizarre. There is this voyeuristic inquisitiveness about what did you do, and what was that like, and how did you feel? And I'm thinking to myself, this is not a conversation I want to have, because you really don't understand the depth of emotion that's attached to these questions.
Yeah, and I don't know how many times in an airport or on an airplane I've noticed someone and thought, I think that might be a veteran. And if they look my way or seem to invite a conversation, I'll say hi and we'll start a conversation. And generally, at some point, they ask you what you do. And when I say, oh, well, I work on moral injury in veterans, military veterans, and they'll look at me and they'll say, what is that? And I'm about 2 sentences into a definition, and often they'll get a look of recognition in their eyes and they'll say, oh, I think I might have that. Or, oh, I have a friend, I think he might have that. And so that's a whole different kind of conversation you can have when
Mhm.
they step into that space.
And Doctor, can I
Yes,
just bring
yes.
in Leo there, because we've said that in the podcast. What's your, in the Irish way of saying it, he goes, the penny dropped. You know,
Yeah.
the penny drops when you talk to someone.
Yeah, it
No,
does.
exactly, Rita. You know, we've said this a few times because in the last couple of years I've been interacting with a lot of veterans from this battle in the Congo, and with some of the veterans say, "Yep, now you tell me, now I understand." But it's mostly with their children,
Yeah.
and now their children are all in their 60s and 70s now. You know,
Mhm.
and they say, "Yep,
Not all of
yeah,
them.
yeah." Well, okay, you're the baby among us, but yeah, but in the ones
Just
that I listen to that young fella put me in my box, huh? No, but the penny does certainly drop.
Yeah.
The red flag goes up, but the light comes on, like the person you mentioned in the flight, you know, oh, I might have that.
Uh-huh.
And because they then recognize it, there's something, oh, they're not ashamed of it, or to stop being ashamed. And then they start talking about it. And over the last 2 years, I've seen people improve as a result of it.
That's right.
A bit like Wally has said,
Well, once
we listen to them so they
yeah.
can speak.
Well, I think when you're holding it inside and not dealing with it, it's really driving your sense of who you are, and you're afraid of it. And once you can talk about it, it something outside of you that you can now examine and begin to process, and then it isn't all of who you are. There's a way that it relativizes the pain of it when you begin to talk about it. And I have veteran friends that every time I talk to them, and if we go into the moral injury stuff, they will be talking about their experience in a different way. And so that means they're processing. Every time they say they mention it, it's a little different. And that's a really good sign. I have a friend who says if they tell you the story the same way every time, they're hiding behind the story.
Oh, I like that.
Rita, what's your experience with women veterans? I have a real concern about that. I'm really very sensitive. I have a wonderful wife. I have two lovely daughters. I care about how they feel and what they think about. And we've had the Irish Women of Honor on the podcast. We've spoken with them, and the kind of betrayal that women veterans talk about is not only betrayal by government and military authorities, but by their comrades that they thought were there to have their back in the same way that the women would have the backs of the male veterans. Tell us a little bit about your experience and observations about the added betrayal of women veterans.
Yeah, it's interesting because the first group of veterans that we went through our small group peer facilitated process were all women. And they all had military sexual trauma, which means that they were sexually assaulted in the military. And they had all been recently unhoused with children. So they were living in affordable housing for veterans with children that the Volunteers of America was running. And each of them had a different story about, from their lives and things, but they were all struggling with that sense of having been betrayed by people in their unit, and they didn't feel safe, and all of those things. One of them had an awful childhood. She had a mother who didn't care about her and was sexually abused by members of her family, and she actually sought a better life in the military. And so she was in the military, and it did stabilize her life to some extent, but then she was also sexually assaulted in the military, and so she wound up on drugs and then losing custody of her son because she went to prison for the drugs. And so she had a lot to deal with, and I think it meant a huge amount to the members of the group that they could finally talk about what happened to them and other people would understand what happened to them. And she actually wound up doing very, very well in the program. 2 years after she was out of the, I mean, she went through the program, and then 2 years later, she was at a reunion event with her 20-year-old son, and he pulled me aside and said, you know, our mom was really different when she came home. She stopped being mean to us, and she wasn't like she would listen to us, and it changed our family. I think you saved our family. And so I didn't know that about her. It was just sort of a startling thing for her son to volunteer that 2 years out, she was a different person. Mm-hmm. So just having people who understand what you've been through and believe you and are angry with you, not at you or for you, but with you.
Yes.
Makes a real difference in your being able to have more to who you are than that. Mm-hmm. The first person who shared was someone who only lasted 21 days in boot camp, because when she tried to enlist, they told her she was overweight and couldn't. And so these two male recruiters agreed to put her through a physical fitness program so she could enlist. And so they had her do calisthenics, and they had her do running, and they raped her repeatedly. And she went to her mother, and her mother said, try to stick with it. You'll have a better life in the military. So she stuck with it. She got pregnant. So they actually had a female recruiter take her to a clinic to have an abortion, and then they enlisted her. And she lasted 21 days in boot camp. And so when the group started their meeting, we always asked them to make a squad name, they had totaled up the number of years they'd all been in the military, and it was 61 years. And so they decided they were Squad 61. And that's when she said, I don't belong here. I'm not really a veteran. And I said, why? She said, because I only lasted 21 days in boot camp. And then they wanted to know why. And so she told that story, and they all said, no, you belong here. You swore the oath. You made it to boot camp. You wanted to serve. It's not right what happened to you. You belong. You're really a veteran. So they changed the name of their squad to Squad 6721 for her days. And brilliant. It just it bonded the whole group. It was like the first thing that was sort of the group went through, and they they were furious, and I don't know what, I mean, I wasn't in, they're peer facilitated. We just heard the story about this amazing thing that happened to the group because of their name change. There's something about a group doing that for each other that changes people.
It does. It takes a community, doesn't it, to fix it?
It does.
It does. Not one
it's
single person.
One-on-one therapy is so hard. You have to change yourself.
Yes.
It's hard work. And with a group process, you get all this support. And of course, human beings emotions are highly contagious. So as a group begins to be happy, you pick that sense up too. And that sense of indignation and outrage that that group expressed on her behalf really she felt so supported, and then that they were not willing to let her leave herself out. Yeah. It was magical, just magical. And military folks do that. They have that sense of, one of the facilitators was a man. And we told the group, if you don't want him to be there for some of the things you're sharing, you can ask him to leave. It's okay. That he won't take it personally. They were fine with him.
That's good.
He was a good facilitator. In fact, they were trying to marry him off to one of them at the end of the set.
I was going to say,
5-day.
Can you send me the name of that group and I'll join myself? And the women were some of their cases were pretty serious and difficult. But that group process, I mean, it didn't fix everything for them, but it sure opened doors for processing and lifted them up in ways that really helped them not feel so contaminated and awful. And I remember at the end of the week, one of the women in the group had actually
we have them write letters of unfinished business to people they might have killed or did things that whoever they want to have unfinished business resolved with. And one of the women wrote a letter to her rapist and forgave him.
Wow.
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 And I only know that because at the end of the week, they wanted to they spend 50 hours together. It takes 6 days. At the end of their week together, they wanted to have the last night have a fire so they could burn things they were ready to let go of. And they asked us, who weren't in the group, the staff that were just there to support us, they asked us to come to the burn. And we're like, oh, okay. And then they each read the list of things they were willing to let go of, and they put the paper in the fire. And then there was a long silence while everybody watched the paper burn up. And she read her letter. That was what she was letting go of. She forgave him. She read the letter, and we watched that burn up.
Well, can I just say to you, Doctor, is we're running out of time shortly, but we've got to, we can stay on, but lovely listening. And what you're saying there is the same thing. I forgave, Leon knows this, and what I forgave my dad for the violence he done at home, which kind of goes back to what you were saying about your dad. Yeah. And I understood why my mom, you know, we used to say to her, why are you trying to take our lives? You know, she tried to gas us. We always joke with my older brother and go, well, you turned off the gas. You know, she tried to drown us, but simply because she was completely lost with the Ripple One. But people ask me, and I've repeated this on the shows, who do you love the most? The one that beat you up or the one that wanted to take your lives? I love each with them, because if they'd have had help when they got back, or if they actually understood moral injury, but before my book comes out, that's changed my life and a lot of my siblings, because we understand why he was doing what he was doing. And believe me, he was a very, very violent man. But stay on, please. But Leo, I'm going to drop you back over. You're sitting there now, and I know it's getting late there at your night time.
It's all right. No. I don't really have an awful lot to say, except, Rita, it's been fascinating listening to you. And as I said already, what we're doing now, I feel a bit more confident about what we're doing from having listened to you. I think we're on the right track. And for that alone, it's been wonderful just listening to you. And thank you very, very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. It's my life's work. It's the most interesting and important work I've done in my whole life.
I consider, I always say, Doctor, I say it's the best non-paying job I've ever got, because I really enjoy it. Like, it's like wake up in the morning, put the time in, I enjoy it. And just, I think the understanding and acceptance of what happened, but education, teach the next people that are going in and let them know this could happen to you and recognize it. Yeah.
And I get the pleasure of being paid to do it. So,
okay, well, I'll come work for you, and I'll leave these guys soon.
Okay.
I got a job offer.
But it's unusual work. I mean, most of my life I've been an academic, so to be actually hands-on work is really. I have to say the veterans, the people that come through our programs, are some of the finest people on the planet.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the paradox of moral injury. If you have it, there's a good part of you that's suffering enormously.
Just talk about it. Talk about it. Talk about, like you said, like us just talking here. It's 4 people just talking about our life experiences. No more, no less. Wally, can I get you in there, and then we'll let Doctor have the final word, and then we'll wrap up the show for today.
Sure. Yeah, Rita, I'd just like to thank you for being with us. I hope that we have an opportunity to invite you back and in the future, and we can talk more and respond maybe to some of the questions that we get. And what a privilege it is to have the opportunities to reach out to veterans, because they are the finest people, and the affirmation that when we send our sons and daughters, our mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers off to war, we want them to go as good people, and we want them to come back as good people. And the fact that they experience moral injury is a strong indicator that they are not sociopaths or psychopaths, but that they're they're us, and we can welcome them home with open arms and open ears. So thank you.
And Doctor, could you give us, look, it's just been a pleasure and an honor to have you on. I hope you come back on and sit on a panel again, because it's fascinating listening to your story. I could go on as I keep going all day, but thank you so much. Can you finish off with some advice for our listeners all over the world, please?
What I'd like to say is, if you're experiencing what you think is moral injury, you're feeling pain about things happening in the world, or moral distress around anything, that pain you're feeling needs to be listened to, because it's really the good part of you that wants out from under the burden it's carrying.
Doctor,
and to know that that's the
please.
goodness in you. Yeah, no, to know that that's the goodness in you.
It is.
And it's fragile and precious. Yeah.
We've all got some goodness in there. We're just working it out through moral injury.
Yep.
Doctor, it's been just an absolute pleasure. It really has been. And thank you so much. And hopefully we'll have you back on. For today, guys.
I'd love to be back.
Oh, thank you. Leo, Wally, for tonight, and our listeners all over the world, contact moralinjuryinternational.com for full views. See you guys.
Good luck.
Good night.
God bless.
Night.
Good night. Good night.
Sorry, guys, I'm just doing the recording of